Okay, quick recap. So far, we've discussed the division of labor and how it's made possible by trade, and then how that trade is facilitated through a common commodity, say money. If you missed it, you can click here, here, or here. The question that Smith is going to deal with in this chapter is how it is that different goods and services are actually valued. To better understand what Smith means when he says value, I made a short introductory video. You can find it over here. I have to admit that this is by far the hardest chapter I've come across up until now. Let's start by talking about what wealth is. Wealth, if you think about it, is actually the amount of luxuries that a person can afford in their lifetime. The more luxuries they can afford, the more wealthy they are. But once the division of labor has taken place, very few of those luxuries are actually provided by a person's own labor, which means that a person's actual wealth can be measured by the amount of other people's labor that he or she can afford. And this is the point that Smith will continue to make through his entire chapter, and hopefully he drives it home. He says that the only real measure for any commodity out there is labor. The real price of anything to anyone is actually the amount of effort they are willing to expend to get it. And this works the other way. A person's willingness to part with a given object is going to be measured by how much effort parting with it will actually save him. So let's break this down in simpler terms. There's a guy out there and he makes bread, and he can make about 6 loaves in an hour. So essentially this means that a baker's hour is worth 6 loaves. But what he needs is a new winter coat. If he were to make his own coat, it would take him an hour. Therefore, the amount of money that he's willing to spend in order to buy his new winter coat can't be more than 6 loaves of bread. Now, obviously this example is a gross oversimplification, but if you think about it, at its core, at its very essence, every object, good or service or commodity out there is valued by the amount of labor put into it. Smith says that despite this being the case, we very rarely use labor in order to estimate value. It's really hard to figure out the proportion of value between two different measures of labor. You can't just measure it in straight up minutes spent. Some labor requires more physical effort, some requires more ingenuity, some requires more risk. And every job out there, every type of labor out there, down to flipping burgers, requires some measure of education. So how do we measure all of this? Is the hour of one man who works physically hard the same as 2 hours of someone who sits at a desk? Is an hour of someone who spent 10 years learning their trade 10 times more valuable than an hour of someone who spent 1 year learning theirs? This is an impossible calculation. So what are we supposed to do in the practical world? Smith says we let the market decide. Haggling and bartering in the marketplace, although not an exact measure, does give us sufficient information in order to carry out our daily lives. Which is why when we think about the value of commodities, we think about them in terms of money. Because one is something we can touch and feel, and the other is just an abstract term. Still, Smith continues to argue that commodities' true value lies in labor. This is because the real value of even our commodities of exchange have a tendency to vary. All forms of currency out there are traded one amount one day and either more or less the next. Things that fluctuate in and of themselves can never serve as true measurements for other things. Imagine that a liter of water one day looked like this and the next day looked like this. Yardsticks need to stay a yard. And this is why labor is the only accurate measure. Because to the person employing the labor, it will always be worth the same. The price the laborer pays, an hour of his time, to him is always going to be worth the same. Which is why we're even able to say something like, I got paid well or I got paid poorly for my work. When you say well or poorly, it is in proportion to what the real value is. And the real value is your labor. And it doesn't ever change in any given situation, in any time period, in any place. If it required a lot of labor, it's worth a lot and it costs a lot. And if it required a little labor, then it's worth very little. But we still live in the real world and we still estimate things in money. But Smith says that is not their real value. It is their nominal value. As a side note, Smith also talks about labor as having some kind of nominal shifting price. To the person purchasing the labor, sometimes he's willing to pay more and sometimes he's willing to pay less depending on his need. But it's important to remember that that is the nominal price of labor. Going back to the man digging wells in Venice, if a man did want a well in his backyard in Venice, it would be a convenience, but he would never pay more than that convenience is worth to him. Still, for the man digging the well, the labor expended is worth exactly the same whether he builds that well in Venice or in the middle of the Sahara. Now, going back to our original problem, which is that we live in the real world, we still need to be able to estimate things' value in money. And when we do this, there's 2 things that we have to take into consideration, and these are time and space. No, not that kind of space. Let's try and understand time first. What kinds of transactions happen over long periods of time? Loans and leases, right? So let's say you're a good English lord and you have this grand estate, and you have to rent out these plots of land on your estate in order to be farmed by your farmers. You have decisions to make, and that is how much you want to rent this land out for, bearing in mind that leases of this kind often lasted hundreds of years. You have studied the market and you've realized that this plot of land at this given time and the amount that it can produce is worth £100 a year. So you say to your farmer, every year in order to farm this land, you must give me £100. But as the years and decades go by, this solid number of 100 pounds starts being worth less and less. It can start being able to buy less and less. So you don't do that. Instead, you tell your farmer that in order to farm this land, every year he has to pay you 10 sacks of corn. For the first few years, this amount of corn sells for roughly 100 pounds at the local market. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but somewhere around 100 pounds. But as the years and decades go by, you start getting more money for it. And it's not because the value of corn went up, it's because the value of money went down. So while the value of corn may fluctuate slightly from year to year, it won't fluctuate significantly over a long period of time. A sack of corn will have the same real value, as in the same buying power, in 1800 as it will in 1900. The real value of money, on the other hand, would be completely unpredictable over that period of time. Why does this happen? The short answer is inflation. I'm fairly certain that when Smith started to describe inflation, it was a pretty new thing. He says this happened because princes and rulers very often felt the need to lessen the proportion of real gold and value in their coins, and for some inexplicable reason, never felt the need to raise it again. Despite any intention on their part, those coins came to be worthless over time. I mean, even these days, you don't exactly take out a loan for a lump sum of money. They tie it to inflation so that the banks loaning you the money don't lose it from year to year. I found a really cool, easy to understand explanation of how modern inflation works, and I put the link down in the description. Okay, so forgetting about rents and leases, why is it that money can't be used to estimate the value of goods at this point in time, right now, because we live in the right now? Smith says that different commodities in different places are worth different amounts based on the amount that that commodity can purchase in that place. Forgetting all the numerous other factors involved, a pair of Ugg boots in Australia is actually going to go for $115 US, and in the US will go for about $160. That's it. I've spent more than enough time talking this week. See ya.